What does a man give up in his 30s without noticing he gave it up? The decade arrives quiet. There is no ceremony for 30 the way there was for 21. The cake gets smaller every birthday. The party gets shorter. The phone calls from old friends drop from monthly to quarterly. The hangover lasts 2 days instead of half a morning. And somewhere inside that quiet, the decade does its actual work. The work that the next 30 years will look back on as either the most expensive choice or the most lucrative one. Most men cross into 30 without choosing. The decade chooses for them. I'm going to walk you through one decade lived, 2 different ways by the same man. Same starting point, same balance, same job, same Tuesday morning at 30. Different decade. One version of him treated the decade as a window, finite, compound-loaded, with a closing edge somewhere around 40. The other version treated each year as a separate event. Birthday, raise, vacation, hangover, birthday again, repeat. Same calendar, different relationship to the calendar. Both versions go through the same 3 events across the 10 years: the birth of a first child, a job loss, the death of a parent. What changes between the 2 paths is not the events, but the relationship to the decade itself. Where you sit inside your own version of this is the part to keep tracking as we go. Year 30. Both men live in a 1-bedroom apartment. The rent costs $1,600 a month. The balance in the brokerage reads $23,000. The income is $74,000. Same coffee mug, same kitchen table, same window. The first decision of the decade is invisible. Path A opens a calendar, a real one, paper or digital, where the next 10 years sit visible as one continuous block. He writes a number on it. The number is not a goal. The number is a question. Where does the balance need to be at 40 for the next decade to be a different shape? He runs a rough math. The answer is around $350,000. He does not yet know how he will get there. He does know what the unit is. Years, each one. Path B does not open a calendar. Path B has a year. His relationship to decade is bounded by next December at the longest. Beyond December, the calendar dissolves into eventually. Look at this moment, right now. The size of the window through which you look at the next 10 years, not your income, not your intelligence, not your luck, is what makes the difference. The 2 balances at year 30 are identical. The 2 windows are not. What does Path A see at year 30 that Path B does not? Not more information, not more discipline. A simple drawing on a page. 10 years as one block. The age at the bottom of the block is 40. The age at the top is your age right now. That block is the entire variable. From what I have observed across people I have watched do this, and I have watched a number of them, the man who draws the block is almost always playing a different game by year 32 without consciously knowing it. Year 32. Both men get a job offer from another company, same industry. The number is $89,000. Path A spends 3 days reading the offer letter, asking 3 former colleagues what the market rate is, and walking into the salary conversation with a counter of 96. He gets 94. Path B reads the offer twice, says it sounds good, signs it on Tuesday afternoon. The income gap opens. $6,000 a year, not dramatic, roughly $500 a month. Easy to miss inside a paycheck. Roll that number forward. $6,000 a year compounded inside a brokerage account at a long-run return across the 8 years from 32 to 40 is somewhere around $55,000. That is just the negotiation gap. Path A is also putting 20% of the new salary directly into the brokerage as a habit, set on the first paycheck. Path B is not. The actual delta between the two balances at year 32 is $2,000. The actual delta by year 40 is closer to $120,000. Year 32 is where the decade quietly starts charging interest. Neither man knows what is happening in real time. Path A has a frame for it because he wrote the question at year 30. Path B can see the brokerage balance on his phone, but cannot connect it to the offer letter he signed in March. What is the question Path A wrote at year 30 actually doing in year 32? It is letting him hear the offer letter as one decision out of many, not as the only number in the room. Quick pause. The next few minutes get to the most uncomfortable part, the real cost of starting 10 years late, and what the math actually says to a man at 35 looking at the gap. Subscribe if you want to stay with the kind of breakdown that does not smooth that part over. Year 34. Both men have their first child. Same hospital, same Tuesday at 3 in the morning with a newborn on the chest. Same exhaustion. Same question. What does the next 18 years look like? The day-to-day is identical for both. The financial response around that day-to-day is not. Path A has $86,000 in the brokerage, 3 months of fixed expenses in a high-yield account, and a written line in his calendar that says, "Do not touch the brokerage for child-related expenses for the first 2 years." Path B has $31,000 split between brokerage and checking, no separated emergency reserve, and no written line because there is no calendar to write the line on. The first 6 months of child expenses come in around $8,000 for both men. Path A pays from cushion. Path B pays from credit. The credit card carries about 19%. Year 35 is the compound inflection. It is the point where the curves of the two balances stop being parallel and start diverging exponentially. The math is brutal here, and the math is also boring. A credit card balance of $4,400 at 19% paid as the minimum takes Path B approximately 7 years to clear. The 7 years overlap with the rest of the decade. That is the point where most people drop out, not from intention, but from compounded constraint. Path A's $86,000 at year 34 becomes $118,000 by year 35 through contributions plus market drift. Path B's $31,000 becomes $26,000 because of credit pressure and reduced contributions. Same baby, same hospital. Same Tuesday at 3 in the morning. Different decade architecture. If you are at year 34 right now, what is the line in your calendar around child-related expenses? If there is no line, the line will be written for you by whichever credit card has the lowest available balance the first weekend after the baby comes home. I have seen that conversation happen at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning more than once. It does not feel like a financial decision in the moment. It feels like a logistical one. How much of the gap between the two men is the income difference, and how much is the calendar? At 35, with the gap already at $92,000, the income difference explains about $18,000 of it. The other $74,000 is the calendar. Year 36, industry shakeup. Both men get laid off in the same quarter. Same severance package, 2 months. Path A has a runway of approximately 15 months without changing his lifestyle. Path B has a runway of about 6 weeks. The conversations they have with their spouses on the same Saturday afternoon are completely different conversations. Path A is asking what kind of job he wants next. Path B is asking what job he can get next. Both are real questions. Only one of them gives the man the option to wait. Path A waits 11 weeks and lands a role at 11% above his last salary, in part because he was not negotiating from desperation. Path B accepts the third interview, a lateral move at a 5% cut in week 4. The 4-week versus 11-week delta, plus the salary difference, costs Path B another $14,000 across year 36 and 37. It moves one direction, no alternatives. The decade keeps charging. What would your runway be today, in months, if your income stopped this week? Not a hypothetical. It is the year 36 question asked in the present tense. The number you would write down if you ran the math right now is the version of you that is currently on Path A or Path B, regardless of how the rest of the decade has felt. Year 38. Both men's fathers die within the same calendar year. Same loss, same grief. Same 3 days of bereavement leave that the company offers without asking why. Path A flies home, stays a week, hires a part-time helper for his mother for the next 6 months, and pays for the funeral arrangements from Cushion. Path B flies home for the 3 days. He cannot afford to stay longer. The funeral costs come from the credit card he was trying to pay down. The hospice bills that arrive over the next 90 days create a quiet running tension between Path B and his wife about whether his mother can move into the spare room, which the spare room cannot really accommodate. Neither man is a bad son. Both are inside the constraints they built between 30 and 38. The grief is identical. The space around the grief is not. I want to be careful with this one. The financial part of grief is the part nobody wants to talk about, and I would not raise it if it were not the part where the decade's compound work shows up most clearly. You do not see the gap when you check your balance. You see it when your father is dying. The decade ends. Both men turn 40 in the same calendar year. Path A's balance reads $341,000. Path B's balance reads $46,000. The gap is $295,000. Out of the gap, roughly $120,000 is explainable through income difference compounded. The other $175,000 came from the calendar. Hal Hirschfield at UCLA has spent years studying what he calls future self continuity, the degree to which a person can feel their 40-year-old self or their 60-year-old self as a real person rather than as a stranger. His research finds that people with high future self continuity save more, on average, than people with low future self continuity, even when income and intelligence are matched. The mechanism here is recognition, not motivation. Path A recognizes the 40-year-old as himself. Path B does not from laziness, but because the future self feels like another person to whom he owes nothing. What I take from the Hirschfield work, after sitting with it for a while, is that the calendar is the recognition device. The calendar makes the future self visible. The future self being visible is what closes the gap between knowing and doing. Take those 3 figures, your year 30 balance, your year 40 target balance, and the years between, and read them as one person's continuous problem. That is the entire technique. If you are watching this at 35, and you have been Path B without knowing it, the version of this video that exists for you is not the one that says you missed it. The unit was never the decade. The unit was always the year. There are between 5 and 7 years left in your window where the math still bends sharply your way, provided your calendar opens. The 7-year version of this story produces a year 40 balance somewhere around 180,000 for the man who starts the calendar at 33 or 34. That is not 341. It is also not 46. It is enough to change the shape of your 40s, the spare room, the bereavement leave, the option to wait 11 weeks instead of 4. I'd argue, having looked at the math for people at exactly this point, that 35 is not late. It is late for the version of the decade you thought you were getting. It is on time for a different version of the same arithmetic. This is easy to verify. Takes 30 seconds. Pull up your current balance. Subtract the balance from where you want it to be at 40. Divide by the number of years between today and your 40th birthday. That is your annual gap. If the number scares you, your calendar just became visible. So here is the one step, regardless of which path you are on at the moment of this video. Open a single document. Title it The Decade. Write 4 numbers across the top: your age now, 40, your current balance, and the balance you want at 40. That is the calendar. Everything else in this video, the 89,000 offer letter and the 19% credit card and the 11-week runway, are inputs into that one document. Open the document. Write the 4 numbers. The math is the rest. I want to be specific about why a document is the step and not a decision. A decision is a thing you make once and try to remember. A document is a thing you reopen. The decade is too long for one decision. It is short enough for one document that you look at 4 times a year. The year 32 version of the offer letter, the year 34 version of the line in the calendar, the year 36 version of the runway question. All of them sit inside the 4 numbers at the top of the document. You do not have to know how the decade will run. You have to be able to find the document. Which path have you been on this decade without naming it? And which number goes in the 4th box of your document by Sunday night?